Good to be back. Good to be back at Yale and in this course once again on this really important topic. And I'll assume that nothing much has changed in the ethos of Yale students in the 10 years since well, not quite 10 years since I retired, so that you're still feisty and you'll have disagreements. So the description for today's seminar that I was sent poses two quite different though related questions. One is this: do religious people have good reasons to support pluralistic democracy? Or to quote the precise words of the description, how can we encourage adherents of exclusive faith traditions to affirm the political project of liberal pluralistic democracy? And the other question that was in the description I got was this: what is the role of religious reasons in public political debate within a pluralistic democracy? Or in the precise words of the description, for what reasons and under what conditions should democratic citizens appeal to matters of religious faith in public discourse? I trust you see, as I saw, the difference between those two questions. The first asks whether religious people have good reasons to support a certain kind of political structure, namely pluralist liberal democracy. The second assumes the existence of a religiously pluralistic democracy, and it asks what should be the role of religious reasons within such a democracy in public debate about political issues. Both of those support for the structure and reasons for political debate within the structure are important. Both are huge. The sensible thing for me would be to choose one of the two and talk only about it, but I've chosen today not to be sensible and to say something about each of them. Here goes, in the order of mention. What I say on the first is going to overlap, interestingly, with some things Miroslav said, and we did not coordinate this. So start with the first. A little bit of really quick, brisk history. Liberal or pluralistic democracy emerged in the West out of the breakdown of Christendom. And what was Christendom? Well, Christendom assumed a religiously unified society. Specifically, it assumed a society in which everybody was Christian, in which everybody was baptized. Of course, parenthesis, everybody knew that here and there within Europe there were people who were not baptized, in particular Jews, not only, but in particular. But the theory did not take account of their presence, with the result, as you know, that the position of Jews was not only theoretically anomalous, but often politically precarious. They had no clear position in the structure, unlike the millets in Islam. Now, given a society of Christians, the basic idea of Christendom was this: that this religiously unified society, that's a crucial part of it, that this religiously unified society had two rules, as they were standardly called, two rules, two governances, both being manifestations of God's rule. One rule was that of the church, and one rule was that of the empire. And since both were over the same people, the differentiation between these two rules could not be by reference to the subjects, but had to be by reference to the aspects of people's lives that these two rules governed, right? So one people, but two rules over different aspects of their lives. So it was a division of powers rather than a division of subjects. Often it was said that the church ruled over the spiritual life of the people and that the empire ruled over the secular life of the people. The latter, that the empire rules over the secular life, was by no means interpreted to mean that the empire stayed out of moral and religious matters. It was, on the contrary, to the best of my knowledge, universally agreed that it was the duty of the emperor, the ruler, to cultivate morality and true religion in the people. And not just to cultivate, to enforce. Now, as you would guess, there were all kinds of hassles over what this spiritual secular division came from. So Western Christendom was filled with hassles on that score, and by and large they were settled less by theoretical acuity than by who had the appropriate power at the moment. So you got the picture? A religiously unified people under these two rules. And I think it was pretty clearly the breakup of the Western Church. Oh, the Eastern Europe, I'd have to say different things about it, sorry. Okay, so it was the breakup of the Western Church in the 1500s that eventually caused the collapse of Christendom and forced Europe to rethink its political structure and the relation between that and religion. At first it experimented with little Christendoms, mini Christendoms. Germany would be a Lutheran Christendom. Spain would continue to be a Catholic Christendom. Switzerland would be a Reformed Christendom. Scotland would be a Presbyterian Christendom. England would be an Anglican Christendom, and so forth. But very soon, religious diversity got inside of all these mini Christendoms, and that idea, Christendom became impossible over both maxi and mini forms, became impossible as a political structure. Well, to take enormous leaps, after centuries of confusion, ferment, and bloodshed, there eventually emerged, towards the end of the 1700s, the American experiment of liberal, pluralistic democracy. There was a lot of stuff in between, but so it's not just out of the blue. It was, I think we tend to forget, a radical and a risky experiment. Much about it had never been tried before. And in particular, nothing like the relation between religion and the state that the constitutional founders proposed had ever been tried before. So here's the central question. And what was the new proposed relation between the religions of the people and the state, the American state? I think we can probably summarize it in the following 4 structural principles. First, church and state are to be distinct institutions. Synagogue and the state, mosque and the state, you get the point. There's to be a distinction, a clear distinction between ecclesiastical religious institutions and the state. Of course, as I've just observed, there had long been such a distinction in the West. So this was not an innovation on the part of the American founders. They were carrying on what they knew from their Western antecedents, a clear institutional distinction between church and state. Second, that was the first. Second important structural principle was freedom of religious exercise. The state is to not govern how people exercise their religion. Third, the state, when distributing benefits and burdens, is not to differentiate in its treatment of citizens on account of their religion or lack thereof. Let me say it again. The state, in its distribution of benefits and burdens, whatever, is not to discriminate among its citizens on the basis of their religion or lack thereof. It's going to discriminate on some other bases, but it's not to discriminate on that basis. And here's a fourth principle. Fourth, there is to be no differentiation among citizens in their right to hold office in the state and in their right to political voice in the conduct and the personnel of the state. No discrimination among people on the basis of their religion as to whether you can hold office or on whether you've got voice in electing people for positions in the state. What do you think? I think those 4 principles, structural principles about the relation of religion and the state, are essential to the very idea of a liberal or pluralistic democracy. You can have a democracy in the absence of those 4 principles, in the sense that you can have people voting for positions in the regime and so forth, but you don't have a liberal, pluralistic democracy. Okay. Let's not, and this gets to Miroslav's point, let's not conceal from ourselves the fact that acceptance of those four principles requires a lot of, I'll call it this, requires a lot of shaping up on the part of both the state and the religions present in society. Each party, the state, and the religions have to refrain from doing a lot of what they have historically done. Now, fortunately, at the time of the American founding, most of this shaping up had already occurred or was about to occur in the U.S. with respect to the state and the religions. People were beginning to think along these lines, so nobody had to force them into thinking along these lines. But, to repeat, it was historically a radical and risky experiment. A state with no official religion, a state with no official religion in any way had never seriously been tried before. Now, we're all aware of the fact that many religious people around the globe do not like this kind of democracy. And I dare say that many of you, probably most of you, are aware that some of those people are located in this country, that is, in the United States. U.S. is not this country for all of you here, I'm sure. That is to say, let me put it more bluntly, there are a lot of present-day American Christians who do not like liberal democracy, that phase of it that I described. That was clear from the Howard Ross quotation. A good many Christian leaders, including some theologians, have what I can only think of as an extremely sour attitude towards liberal democracy. Now, a number of reasons for that, as you'd expect. But if I hear correctly, there's one common theme running through those in this country and abroad. And that theme is this. Once upon a time, the state was the highest expression, or one of the two highest expressions, of the religio-moral unity of a people. Here's where their religious moral unity came to its topmost institutional expression. A liberal, democratic society is committed to its not being that. It's not giving expression to any one particular religious party. It's committed to being no more than an arrangement of convenience, so it's said, whereby a number of such distinct communities can live together. But it itself is a-religious. It's a-moral. An arrangement of convenience for such communities. And, okay, here's the real point. And thereby it forces a dichotomy into the lives of religious people. It forces them to divorce their religion from their politics. The Muslims who live in this country cannot live by Sharia. They can't. And you can fill out the counterparts for any other religion you want. One of the most influential 20th century Muslim writers, I'm going to mispronounce his name, I'm sure, so you can tell, those of you who know how to pronounce it will tell me afterwards, Sayyid Qutb, an Egyptian intellectual who was executed by the Egyptian government in 1966. Qutb had lived for a time in the US, out in Colorado, and had found American life abhorrent. In the lives of America, there is what he called, marvelous phrase, a hideous schizophrenia. A hideous schizophrenia between religion and life. And he thought this hideous schizophrenia had its origins in original Christianity, where he thought that Jesus had spiritualized the Jewish religion. And he thought that liberal democracy, by its very structure, expressed and reinforced this hideous schizophrenia. It forces the privatization of religion. And if the four principles that I cited are indeed basic structural principles of liberal democracy, then, in a structural sort of way, he's right about that. That kind of shaping up of religion is required by the very structure of a liberal democracy. So pull it together like this. If religious people have good reasons for supporting liberal pluralistic democracy, those reasons will have to support those four principles and the kind of division that I mentioned. Now, I think that some religious people do have good reasons for supporting those four principles. To speak for myself, I think Christianity provides such reasons, though there are a lot of my fellow Christians who disagree. Now, I said I was going to talk about both questions, but I've really almost eaten up my time. So what do you think, Miroslav? Shall I just cut off what I have to say about religious reasons and liberal democracy?
No.
Sum it up.
Okay.
Otherwise it will remain a secret.
Okay, so now the second question. So my citation of those four principles may well have left you thinking, as it did Kutum, that there just isn't any place for religious reasons and public debate in a democracy. You may have concluded that the principles, those four principles, rule it out. And quite a few writers in recent years have made that inference, that the very idea of a liberal democracy rules out the use of religious reasons in public debate. But I think that's a mistake. Though government, in the ways I mentioned, has to be impartial in its treatment of citizens with respect to their religion or lack thereof, I think that does not imply excluding religious reasons, excludes thinking religiously about political topics and speaking up. Now, in your reading for today, there are some pieces that introduce you to that debate that's been going on for 2 decades, whatever. So you know the basic issues. I'm not going to dabble into all of them, but I think it may be helpful to bring these two topics together. If I briefly review why John Rawls thought it was one of the principles of liberal democracy that citizens should use what he calls public reason and not religious reasons in public debate. So this will sort of tie the two together, okay? Rawls. I talked about the structural features, four of the structural features of a liberal democracy. Rawls was of the view, and I share this view, Rawls was of the view that behind these structural principles, there's a certain cluster of ideas about how citizens are to treat each other. And that the structure is an expression of these background, implicit ideas as to how we should treat each other. These background ideas make sense of the structure. It's not just a happenstance. And Rawls thought then, obviously, that citizens who really believe in liberal democracy, as opposed to just putting up with it, implicitly accept these background explanatory principles. They don't have them at the top of their heads, it's implicit, but they're implicitly accepting it if they agree with liberal democracy instead of just putting up with it. Here's one of those important implicit background principles Rawls thought. We are to treat each other as free and equal. Fundamental explanatory background principle. Citizens are to treat each other as free and equal. Okay? So now, says Rawls, ask yourself this question. What does that principle, treating each other as free and equal, what does that principle imply for how we debate and decide political issues? What does the free and equal principle imply for how we conduct our debates? And here's Rawls' answer. At least when it comes to important issues of justice, we should stand ready to appeal to principles that we can expect all of our fellow citizens to share. Or at least all who sincerely believe in liberal democracy. The others may not share it. We should appeal to principles that we can expect all the believers, our fellow believers in liberal democracy, to share. Otherwise, here's Rawls' thought, if we just go ahead and vote our own view, we're imposing our views on the others and not treating them as equal. I'm saying, I know better than you what the laws of this land should be like. I'm not treating you as a co-author of the laws. Now, it should be obvious at a glance that that principle eliminates the use of religious reasons, because one thing you can be absolutely sure of, any religious reason that you can devise is not going to be shared by some of your present-day fellow Americans, right? Okay. So where do we find the shared reasons? And Rawls's ingenious, I think of it as a bootstrapping suggestion, Rawls's ingenious suggestion was this. Here's where you can find the principles. Look back once again at those principles implicit in liberal democracy that we got this first one from, treating everybody as free and equal. Look back at the other implicit principles. Everybody who accepts liberal democracy believes those, right? So that's going to be our body of our shared principles. That's what he called public reason. It's going to take some work to dig them out. They're implicit. That's what political philosophers are for, and so forth. But that's what we should appeal to. It won't matter, says Rawls, if religious people add on some religious reasons. It's okay. And it won't matter if we're debating minor matters. My memory of New Haven is that always by Thanksgiving there was a great big tree, Christmas tree on the green, and there's not this year. So New Haven must have had a dispute about that. And Rawls would say they don't have to avoid using religious reasons to settle. I mean, it's unlikely. Well, somebody might. No big deal. Huh? That's what I expected. So, let me draw it to a conclusion. I'm not going to rehearse my reasons for thinking that this proposal, ingenious and interesting as it is, doesn't work. It's my impression that the state of the debate over this now is that it's widely agreed that those opposed to using religious reasons in public debate have not succeeded in making their case. So here's my own view, briefly presented. With two crucial qualifications. My view is this. I think it's okay for citizens to use whatever reasons that they themselves have for their political views, or whatever reasons they find cogent. Rarely, if ever, does it happen that consensus emerges. So I think a crucial part of liberal democracy is a fair vote. And I find it's endlessly curious that Rawls and Audi and Larmor and so forth, Habermas, say almost nothing about vote. I think we never achieve consensus, so we have to have a fair vote. Here are the two qualifications. The entire debate takes place within the framework of a constitution. Some proposals are just off the table, or they're so hard to get onto the table that they may just as well be off the table. That's the great protection in a liberal democracy against the oppressive rule of the majority. There's a constitution which says these things can't be done. Second, I've come to think that the character of the debate is important, how the debate is conducted. Not so much as content, but how it's conducted. Citizens are to treat each other civilly, become informed, be willing to present their reasons to others, be willing to listen to the reasons of others. And let me just say parenthetically that one of my great, what word do I want? Sorrows, laments, whatever, is that American political dialogue is so uncivil, it is so chock full of people demeaning their fellow citizens. Whatever be their reasons, they should never demean their fellow citizens. So I think the debate over whether religious reasons are acceptable was an important debate to have, but I think the real discussion now has to be over, And how should we conduct that debate so that we treat our fellow citizens with dignity and honor and justice and respect?